Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, what life was like in the industrial Connecticut Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the community has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and select historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the French Canadians in Holyoke. So, why did people from Quebec come to Holyoke?
They mostly came for the jobs. There was a great need for more work, and Quebec wasn't being developed in industrial sense. And also some of the farms were starting to be pushed out into very, very narrow areas, very poor areas, poor soil. And they tried to keep these farms going with large families, and it did not succeed. So they were looking for places to move on with their lives, and New England, which had the Industrial Revolution going, was a great place to go. It's always hard to leave your homeland. You prefer to stay with people that speak your language, have your same culture, but they had a choice, but they knew their society would not succeed the way it was. So they moved onwards. Now, they came to Holyoke because Holyoke was part of that industrial movement, and there was going to be loads of jobs in this brand new city. And for the most part, they started coming in late 1860s, but the Great Wave didn't happen till the early 1890s, and it continued up to about 1914. And it became the number one ethnic group in Holyoke ever up to that point, and stayed up to that point until they were finally surpassed in numbers, historic numbers, only about 5 years ago. And so the French Canadians were in greater numbers than the Irish ever were, in greater numbers than the Polish ever were. And they were higher even than the Puerto Ricans were until 5 years ago, when the Puerto Ricans' population finally passed 20,000, which was the historical peak of the French Canadians coming to Holyoke. So that's an incredible fact, and you would almost never know it unless you looked around carefully, because the French Canadians were always a quiet people, and they stayed to themselves, which is the total opposite of what the Irish, the Polish, and the Puerto Ricans are. And so it was the largest at one time, but it was the least known.
And also, which churches did the people from Quebec go to?
All right, the first one that they went to was St. Jerome's, but that one was for all comers, mostly the Irish, and so they really wanted their own church to happen. And so it did happen. So today we're talking about churches, schools, and the rest of their culture remnants within Holyoke. And so the first up is the churches. They started up the Precious Blood Church, 1869, for 1 year at the Exchange Hall, and then for 5 years at a small wooden church on Cabot Street. And then from 1875 onwards up to 1989, they were at a brick and mortar church on Cabot Street. That was taken down in that year. Now, in 1875, there was a horrible fire in that wooden church, and we're going to talk about that story, especially next year in the year 2025, because that's the 150-year anniversary of that church. The next French Canadian church to come around was the Our Lady of Perpetual Help, the Notre Dame de Secours Perpetuel, which came around the year 1890, and that happened at a place where the modern Mata del Rosa School happened. And they stayed there to 1925 until they moved upwards to a place near the Lawrence School. and that tragedy burned in the year 1998. All right, so that congregation started up on its own. It didn't need to be a mission church. But the next church to come around was the Immaculate Conception Church in 1902. It was a mission church, a perpetual help church, and that was located in the flats on North Summer Street. Now, it started out in a mission-style church that was all brick and was flat-roofed, and that stayed around for a long time, but it served for the church for a couple decades until about 1923 when it got its own large church, the Immaculate Conception Church, and that stayed active as a church, and then they replaced it with a wooden-clad church, and that stayed active to 2 years ago when they combined with the St. Jerome's Church. So the French Canadians have been very active around Holyoke.
And real quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanoetour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout. And for private tours or other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214B@yahoo.com. And his tours make for educational and fun outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, now, which schools did the people from Quebec attend?
Yes, the schools that they attended were almost always Catholic schools, and it wasn't until about the 1960 that they left that and started going to public schools. But its schools include the Precious Blood School for boys, School for girls, and the Precious Blood High School, which lasted up to 1972. And the School for boys and girls lasted up to 1980. Then there was the Perpetual Help School, which started right away as soon as the church started up. And when they moved up to the Churchill neighborhood, the school moved with it. And it kept going deep, I think, into the 1990s. And then there's Immaculate Conception. And there, when they first went down into the flats, they had to wait to build their own school. They used the East White Street School for a couple decades, and then they built their own finally, and that was gorgeous, and it's still there. It's so solidly built. It's right next to the old rectory and where the old school church used to be. The Immaculate Conception at one point, and I believe 1971, joined forces with the Rosary and became the Mary Immaculate School. So the schools of the French Canadians have always been strong. They were actually forced in the beginning 1881 by the state to have 3 classes in English and 3 in French, and they wanted to have all 6 in French, but the state didn't allow them to do that.
And what is left of the French-Canadian culture in Holyoke?
All right, all the churches are gone now. They were taken down or burned down. The schools are no longer functional. It's hard to see. There are still some fraternal groups around that are French-Canadian based. There's the Beaver Club of Western Massachusetts that started out in Holyoke in the 1940s. They still exist and meet once a month, so that's great to see. There's still some small level groups that are French Canadians based. There's one in Chicopee that was organized originally in Holyoke that still exists. So these groups are still around, but mostly they've disappeared with the times. And that's because they were never as vocal as the Irish, and the Irish still have their churches, and they still have their big parade. They were never as vocal as the Polish, who still have their school and still have one Polish Mass going. and not as vocal as the Puerto Ricans, who still have, of course, a lot of institutions going around town. So the French Canadians weren't as strong. They had to wait about 100 years to have their first mayor, and that happened when Ernie Prue in the 1970s and 80s served out a 10 years worth of being the mayor. So they've always been a quiet one, but there's still culture around to see.